What's up guys, and welcome to my 4.4 updated GOAT Anaxa Grass guide. In this video I'm taking you over everything you do need to know in order to understand and build them, including a kit overview, best Lightcones, best Relics and Planar Ornaments, main stat goals and substat goals, also including general stat goals as well, and finally general team building ideas. His basic attack is a generic does damage based off his attack to a designated enemy. His skill does wind damage equal to 70% of his attack to a designated enemy and triggers 4 instances of bounce. Each bounce hit does 70% of his attack as wind damage to a random enemy and will prioritize enemy that have yet to be hit by the bounce instances. Damage will also increase by 20% per attackable enemy on the field. His ultimate will inflict sublimation on all enemies and do wind damage based off 160% of Anaxa's attack to all enemies. Sublimation will inflict every kind of weakness onto an enemy and will last until the start of the target's turn. If the target has no control res, they cannot take action. His talent lets Anaxa inflict a random weakness on an enemy for every hit he does do. That will last for 3 turns and will prioritize a weakness type the target does not have. Enemies that have 5 or more different weakness types will gain qualitative disclosure, and Anaxa will deal 30% increased damage to enemies with qualitative disclosure. Anaxa using a basic attack or skill on an enemy that has qualitative disclosure will trigger an additional skill that costs no skill points, cannot trigger itself again, and if the target dies first, it will target a random enemy instead. This technique inflicts terrified on enemies in a set area. Attacking a terrified enemy inflicted from Anaxa's actual technique will be counted as entering battle via a attacking weakness, and when the battle starts, Anaxa will apply one weakness matching the attacker's type to all enemies for 3 turns. For his bonus traces, his A2 gives Anaxa 10 energy when using basic attack, and at the start of his turn, if no enemies are in qualitative disclosure, he will regenerate 30 energy. His A4 is able to provide effects based on the number of erudition characters on the team. If there is only Anaxa as the erudition character on the team, Anaxa's own crit damage will increase by 140%, and if there is one other or more erudition characters on the team, damage dealt by all allies will increase by 50%. Do note, you can't have both of these active. If you just have Anaxa, it will just be the crit damage. If you have 2 or more, the crit damage effect will not be applied, however, the damage percent will be applied. And Anaxa's A6 will give him defense ignore based off every different weakness type the enemy target has, each being 4% that goes up to 7 weakness types, which is a total of 28% defense ignore if the enemy has all weakness types, which he is able to implant. Finally, for his Eidolons, his E1 recovers 1 skill point on first skill cast in the battle, and hitting enemies with Anaxa's skill will decrease their defense by 16% for 2 turns. His E2 decreases enemies entering the field's all-type res by 20%, and will also trigger an instance of the talent's weakness implant effect. His E4 increases Anaxa's attack by 30% for 2 turns when using skill that stacks up to 2 times, so up to 60% attack, and his E6 makes all the damage Anaxa does 130% of the original damage, and his A4 will no longer have a restriction and will always be active on both effects. This means no matter who is on the team, he will have the crit damage buff for himself and also 50% damage for the team. For his best Lightcones, one of his best ones is still his own signature, which provides the wearer 10 energy when the wearer's turn starts, 60% damage when an enemy target has a weakness implanted by the wearer on them, and also attacking an enemy from the wearer will decrease their defense by 12% for 2 turns. So this does complement his own kit well, mainly for the fact of the defense shred. It's not inherently an insane Lightcone or anything, but since the best way to play Anaxa is to stack as much defense shred and ignore you can, this Lightcone is one of the complementary facts to that with the 12% here, and also the damage percent is nice. However, damage percent on Anaxa isn't necessarily the most insane thing, especially since he has a lot of it. The extra energy also can come in clutch. It kind of depends. It does enable some stuff, and this is also really good in a sub DPS role, since he does have the role of being a main DPS or the herd of sub DPS. This is more noticed on the sub DPS rather than the main DPS. For main DPS, he takes enough actions to where you wouldn't really need this. But yeah, the damage percent in general is going to be good for all his roles, and defense shred is going to be good for his main DPS roles, especially when you're stacking more, and even as a sub DPS where you're just increasing others' damage, because regardless, this is going to increase the team's damage. So his signature is still one of the best. The other best for him would be the Herda's Lightcone, which is 12% crit rate, 60% damage to skill and ultimate when the wearer uses their ultimate, and also if ultimate is consuming 140 or more energy, which he does have, will recover 1 skill point. So it makes him easier to build. This is also primarily for main DPS, since it's not really providing any supportive capabilities besides maybe the extra skill point, but makes him easier to build, provides the same damage percent, skill, and ultimate. The only thing would be his signature also affects the basic attack, but ideally you never want a basic attack, but you get the same effect. And also the extra skill point, which on his best teams for main DPS, skill points aren't inherently much of a problem anymore, and could be even less so depending on the team, or could be even more so depending on the team. So this could be clutch, it could be completely worthless, it depends on the team you're running him on, but this is also one of his best options for mainly the main DPS. The signature does outperform in sub DPS potential, but main DPS both are comparative. The free-to-play Lightcone Cosmic Enterprise also does work with 8% attack, and for every one different weakness type an enemy target has, increases damage dealt to it by the wearer by 4% up to 7 weakness types, and an S5 16% attack and 8% damage. This is quite literally made for him as a free-to-play option. Attack is really good on Anaxa since he is attack starved, and he is able to stack this up entirely since he is able to implant every single weakness. So it's also up to a total of 56% damage percent, so that's also nice. So for a free-to-play option, this would be your best choice. You could also use Jing Wan's signature. It's worse than running the free-to-play Cosmic Enterprise, but it's still there. It does increase the wearer's crit damage by 36%, and also skill and ultimate damage will increase by 18%. He doesn't have a follow-up attack, so you ignore that part entirely. So simple, just gives him crit damage, so anytime you crit, more damage, and then more damage percent for skill, which is his main source, and ultimate, which also deals pretty good damage. Finally, you could also use the Battle Pass Lightcone. Today is another peaceful day, which is able to increase damage based off points of max energy. Each point will increase damage percent by 0.20%, with a maximum of 160 energy taken into account, and at S5, it is 0.40. Unfortunately, Anaxa doesn't get the full amount for this because he does have 140 max energy. However, it's still permanent damage percent for all the damage he's doing, so it's also just a light cone that you can slap on him, especially since it's been in the game for a while, so there is a chance you might have it as 5. You can also use Genius's Repose with 16% attack and 24% crit damage, defeating an enemy for 3 turns. S5, 32% attack and 48% crit damage. Like I mentioned, attack percent is really good on Anaxa, and then this crit damage part you also want to have active. As a main DPS, even when he has a bunch of crit damage thanks to the trace, you still want to have it active, or the actual performance of this Lightcone, of course, is going to fall. But if as long as you do have the actual effect, it is quite a good 4-star option. I'm mentioning these just for alternatives. Really, if you don't have his signature or the Herda, just use the Enterprise Lightcone. That's going to give you the best results. For his best relic sets, his best in slot now overall is actually the new Navigator set, with 2-piece increasing attack by 12%, 4-piece when the wearer enters combat or uses a skill, damage dealt by the skill and ultimate increases by 18%, that stacks up to 3 times, and at the start of the wearer's turn or using ultimate will remove 1 stack. So 2-piece being attack percent is very nice, and the 4-piece is able to provide a bunch of damage percent. I did mention he has a bunch of damage percent, but relic sets don't provide you like insane stuff, and this is also providing you upwards of 50 plus. And Anaxa can actually keep this stacked very frequently, especially with his proper team. When you have Cyrene on the team, you're giving him more turns, and he also has his double skill, which he himself is able to make this stack pretty frequently. And then if you have Cyrene on the team for quadruple skill, it becomes that much easier to keep uptime on it. I only really recommend this if you are running his best teams with Cyrene and Ceridra. Otherwise, the performance of this is going to drop significantly, especially if you're doing a -1 setup, because if you don't have Ceridra, you're not going to get quadruple skills to completely just have the effect stack up and just stay stacked for the most part. And in like a -1 setup, he's going to be taking his turn, so that effect is going to remove a stack. He still will be able to net 1, but it still would be a bit annoying. So I primarily recommend this if you are running his best team, because overall, this would be his best in slot. However, Genius set is also still comparable thanks to how it does work. So Genius would be the other option, with a 2-piece being useless. 4-piece is 10% defense ignore, and if they have quantum weakness, an additional 10% defense ignore. So this is practically always a 20% defense ignore, since Anaxa is able to implant every single weakness, which does include quantum. As Anaxa is a DPS that wants to stack defense, shred, and ignore, thanks to his base game providing 28%, potentially more if you have his signature or his E1, so on and so forth, and even more with support Eidolons such as Ceridra E1. And then the other slots would depend. If this actual relic set is pushing you upwards of 80% or higher, then it's going to be the overall best in slot you want to use, even potentially over Navigator. But in any case where maybe you already have 100% because you have like really high investment, or maybe you have a debuffer on the team that's providing more defense shred that's like a big amount, such as 30 to 40%, and you have enough without the Genius set, then of course in that case Genius set is going to be entirely useless. So you're better off using any other relic set that would be beneficial. However, specifically, if it is helping you reach 80%, 90%, or even 100%, this is going to be your other best option to use. Other than that, you would be using Scholar, which now is a worse Navigator, provides 2-piece giving crit rate by 8%, and 4-piece gives 20% damage to skill and ultimate, and using ultimate will increase the next skill's damage by 25%, which is able to carry over through his extra skills, which makes it really nice. Since the damage percent is not as good as Navigator's, just at base it's 20%, which is kind of just like 1 stack of Navigator. Navigator does have slightly less at 1 stack, and the uptime on this can be a bit annoying. Anaxa does get his ultimate frequently, so you still can get it, but a fully stacked Navigator is able to have more than the Navigator set. But the fully stacked Navigator set is able to have more than the 4-piece Scholar set, hence why Navigator is just better. Finally, if you are running him as a sub DPS for the Herda, in that case you would run Eagle. 2-piece is beneficial, increasing wind damage by 10%, 4-piece 25% advance forward when the wearer uses their ultimate. Really, the point here is just to net as many actions as possible, so you can get double skill, you can get your ultimate quicker, so you can get more actions for the Herda going. There are some main DPS setups where you run like attack boots and get around 102 to 103 speed, and go for a -1, but honestly, those teams aren't necessarily too prevalent on Anaxa anymore as the times have changed, his best in slots have changed, so those setups aren't inherently that worth it anymore. And if you're running him with Cyrene, Cyrene's ultimate is Anaxa's turn, so Eagle Set is completely worthless with Cyrene, hence why I only really would use this if you are running him as a sub DPS, because in that case it's his best in slot. As a main DPS, you would use any of the other ones mentioned. And then 2-piece combinations, which I'm going to be honest, you really don't want to do, but if you really need to in the meantime, you could just do 2-piece attack with 2-piece crit. So crit rate would be Scholar or 2-piece Worlder Making. If you want crit damage, Wave Strider or Ever Glorious. And the attack sets would be 2-piece Navigator, you can do 2-piece Hero, 2-piece Wind Soaring, 2-piece Prisoner, or 2-piece Musketeer. Ornaments are also pretty simple. The most consistent one you have is Rutilant with 8% crit rate and 20% damage to basic attack and skill. Skill is his main source of damage, so this is getting amplified, also a bit of crit rate, and the requirement is very easy. So this would be the most consistent. However, there is a better one, specifically if you do have Permanent Dawning on his team, which is actually quite common, and that's Ban and Amusement, with 16% crit damage and an additional 32% if the Wear summon is on the field. Anaxa doesn't have a summon, however, Permanent dedicating Anaxa as bondmate attaches the Soul Dragon, which is considered a summon, so Anaxa in that case has a summon for the full crit damage. So this becomes the best in slot specifically if you are running Permanent Dawning, otherwise don't run it. But since a lot of his teams do have him as a sustain, as he is his best in slot sustain, this can actually be quite a common one to run. But the main sets on the relics, for the body, you're primarily going to run crit rate. However, if you have a lot of crit rate rolls, you can run crit damage instead in that instance. For the feat, if you are running him as a main DPS with Cyrene or even like Sparkle or anything, primarily his best team, Cyrene, Ceridra, that also may include Sparkle depending on your investment. Any of those combinations, always attack percent, don't focus on speed. But if you are running him as the Herda teammate, ideally you get as much actions as possible, so you do go for speed boots. Or if you're still running him on a -1 with someone like Sunday, in that case, you could also do speed boots just so you can get that -1 going. If you're doing specifically Bronya and you have E2 Bronya, in that case, you can do the attack boot setup. So there's also that. For the orb, attack percent is better than wind damage, so you want to go for the attack percent orb in this case. And for the link rope, you want to go attack percent. Specifically for the Herda teammate, you can run Energy Regen, especially if you don't have his signature. It's going to be a big damage drop-off, but to make sure you have uptime on the ultimate, you would need the Energy Regen rate if you don't have his Lightcone. But that's really, and I mean really only for the Herda role, otherwise do not run Energy Regen. For the subsets, if you do have a speed goal, you want to get him to Breakpoint. If you're running a -1, obviously get him 1 speed above the -1 support. For the Herda sub DPS, really just get as much speed as you can as long as it's above Breakpoint. And then if you're running him on the Cyrene team and his best teams in general, then don't bother with speed at all. Then you focus crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent. Crit rate, you want to make sure you get to 100% in battle, as he does have so many instances of attacks. You just want to make sure they all do crit. You can also just focus on getting as much crit damage after that, and also attack percent. So crit rate, 100%. Be sure that you are able to get that. If you're running him as a sub DPS, getting it around 90% is also fine. But as a main DPS, really ensure you get that 100%. Crit damage, getting it to around 120% is going to be good. If you're more focused on his build, then you want to get it to around 140% ideally. 120% is more of the lower side for sub DPS, but do remember his trace, if you are running him as a main DPS, does provide a lot, but you still want to get as much as you can. But since crit rate is a big priority, you would focus on that. So getting around 140% is going to be good. Attack, with all the main stats he does have, especially if you're running attack boots, attack orb, ideally getting it to over 3000 is going to be good. As a sub DPS, if you do have the speed boots, or if you're doing a -1 setup, in that case, if you're a bit below 3000, that's all right. But ideally, you want to hover that 3000 range. With main DPS builds going above that to even reaching around 3500, ideally. Finally, for some general team building ideas, I'm going to start it off with main DPS. The undisputed best team for Anaxa is Ceridra and Cyrene. These teammates do so much for him. Ceridra is able to provide up to 4 skills when she does have her state upgraded to Peerage. And Anaxa is able to supercharge her because he has 2 skills every time we do trigger the Quantum Disclosure. Cyrene's buff for Anaxa is also insanely good, giving him 100% action advance, and also increasing the number of bounce instances by 3 and providing good buffs such as true damage, so on and so forth. So this is like the general core, especially nowadays where we're not really in the era where Anaxa was able to be like, yeah, I can use every single support, since everything was passable, and Anaxa is able to do that, but it's more limited to the support side now, where the weaker ones don't really work, especially now in endgame. So this is like the by far core you want to run. Last slot would go to sustain. In this case, ideally it is Permanent Dawning, especially to fill the whole Crisis Air part. So this is one of his best teams. If you do have E2 Cyrene and you want to run sustainless, then you can sub out Permanent Dawning for another buffer. I really like using Sparkle on this team because it does give Anaxa a bit more actions, and her amp is also just really insane. So you can get some out of Cyrene turn actions. Since Cyrene's ultimate is the one that gives them it, you just want to make sure you time it so you don't end up using like a full burst from like the Peerage upgraded state to get quadruple skills, because ideally you want to have that with the Cyrene buff active. But Sparkle can help some downtime on Cyrene's ultimate by giving Anaxa more turns, and on this team he's very buff, so his damage is going to be very good. But you can also very much use someone like RMC on this team as well, which can also help remedy if you don't have E2 Cyrene, since you can start off by putting the mem buff on Cyrene to get quicker ultimates. And there's a lot of setups you can do, because then eventually you can time it to where you can have mem buff go on Anaxa eventually, and then you have those also downtime on Cyrene ultimate turns. So there's that too. But if you're not really running this team, Ceridra is still like important on the other teams as well. So in this case, you could just run Sparkle and then Sustain, which would be like this. If you're running a -1, then instead you would use someone like Sunday. If you're doing the base speed Anaxa with E2 Bronya setup to create the -1, then instead in the slot would be Bronya. So you just put her there. Ceridra, not having her is going to be a big drop off. However, if you have invested in supports, you can make it work. Like you still can run a Cyrene team without Ceridra. Like it's going to be a lot worse, but if you don't have her, you don't have her. So in these cases, you would run something like this. If you're still able to do sustainless thanks to investment on these others, then you could also change it out to have someone like Tribi, or even someone like Mortanix Blade, because his general debuffs is just really good. But finally, if you are running him as a sub DPS for the Herda, I don't have the Herda, so I'm just going to go ahead and put the mini Herda here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put her there. Usually the Herda teams would be Anaxa as the sub DPS, the Herda is the main DPS, and then Tribi, because Tribi does a lot for the Herda, and also is an AoE buffer to buff both their damage. So it's not just the Herda getting buffed, and last slot would be Folkwolf for energy and also attack related buffs. So they're getting buffed equally here. Anaxa would do less damage because if you don't have E6, you're not going to have the actual crit damage trace, so his damage does fall off a lot. But here he is still getting double buffed. So a sub DPS Anaxa on a Herda team would look like this. And that is the full 4.4 updated Anaxa guide. I do hope you found this video helpful. If you did, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell for future videos like this, along with all the types of content. I'll see you later. Peace out.